So in this class, I want to speak about literature, drinking, getting drunk, the act of music, and in the end, women and women slaves. So what does this all have to go with, or what does this all have to do with medieval Islamic history? We were talking about the creation of an Islamic civilization or culture, essentially starting between the year 800 to 1000. That is when a canon, a discourse of authorities, of literature, works, of ideas, and of terminology came together to form the basic discourse of Islamic civilization. We've spoken different parts about the nature of Islamic law, about hadith, about the development ultimately of something called philosophy, through the translation movement and through the natural sciences. But there's another part of it, which is the development of literature, specifically of poetry and prose. Now, all of this comes together into a field called Adab. Adab has essentially two meanings. It's literature itself, what it might call belles lettres in French, poetry, prose, fine writing, letters written, but it also has a different aspect to it, which is not just the literature itself, but also a way of behaving. It's about knowing how to behave properly and sophisticatedly in high society. And in fact, the two things are connected. You have to know your literature, you have to know your culture in order to be urbane, right? So even we have this idea in English, difference between urbane and urban, someone who is citified or of the city, who is transformed by the process of encountering others in the city and becomes a deeper, broader person in that sense. So one thing to think about, the people who have adab are called adibs. More often you'll see it in the plural as uduba. They are basically the literati. They're the ones writing the poetry, compiling it, writing dictionaries, or rather biographical dictionaries about people who compose poetry. They're going out into the desert to study the Arabic of Eastern Arabia to get a better sense of what the original poetry of the Arabs was. They're combining all of this together basically between the years 800 and 1000. Some of it, of course, as we'll see, does have connections to the religious sciences, but not all of it does. For example, they wanted to understand Arabic better because the Quran is in Arabic and it's supposed to be the perfection of human language. And so to get through the difficult parts or to have a better grasp of its aesthetics, you have to have a better grasp of Arabic. And so people in 9th century Baghdad started going out into Eastern Arabia trying to understand what was the Arabic back in the time of the Prophet Muhammad. In that, they developed, linguistic sciences and so forth. Now, one last thing, adab is supposed to be a sort of general knowledge. It's kind of everything you need to know to be cultured. It is very different from, or at least kind of the opposite of ilm, which is specific systematic knowledge about one topic. So ilm is a focused type of knowledge. Adab is a broad, general knowledge. We talked about ilm before. It's just the normal word for sciences, but really it's just kind of systematic knowledge. So there's all sorts of different texts that were developed over the time. One of the most some of them are actual translations, like this one, Kalila wa Dimna. This is a set of fables, kind of like Aesop's fables, using animals as characters. It's not a direct translation, but it is taken from Sanskrit and Persian models at the time, and is translated by Ibn al-Muqaffa, who's kind of one of the first major figures in the development of adab. And as you can see, was also kind of at the transition between the Umayyads and the Abbasids right at that moment. But most of the work was not prose, but was poetry. And remember, the Arabs in pre-Islamic Arabia were obsessed with poetry, like literally obsessed. Most of them didn't know how to write or read, but they knew thousands of lines of poetry, and they just went around reciting it and composing it whenever they to commemorate any sort of event, and especially attacks on other tribes, etc. Throwing out pieces of poetry was a way to boast about your capacity to exact revenge or to do a successful raid. It was just as vicious as the physical attack could be. And if you sent out a line of poetry into the public, you could expect a reprisal, both either physical or poetical. And that obsession with poetry probably is perhaps somewhat unique to the Arabs. You can read Michael Cook about this, about the culture of poetry in the period. But it also transferred over in general to the court once the Abbasids had developed a larger court system. Baghdad became this opulent capital of the entire world. And poetry, specifically poetry in Arabic, was seen as the high point of learning and of culture. Poets spent large amounts of time composing poetry. They also tended to discuss it or perform it extemporaneously, that is, on the spur, on the cuff, off the cuff rather. And they created massive reputations of it. They would study languages to figure out what exactly it is that made good poetry good. What is the nature of aesthetics of language, to understand the very basis of why certain ideas linguistically worked. And this was a process that many people had just by listening to poetry, but they formalized it into a system of knowledge. And in fact, if you remember from one of our readings, we talked. There was a situation in which a Khariji, so one of these pious, ultra pious believers who split off from the early Muslim community, was about to fight another group. And they decided, because he was a nomadic Arab, that he should be asked as an arbiter of what is good poetry or not. And ultimately, even he was clearly able to give clear advice as to who was the better poet and why and how. So there was always an inbound sense of aesthetics, and this was kind of formalized and developed further by the scholars in the 9th and 10th centuries in Baghdad and Basra. Now, poets could come from a variety of backgrounds. They weren't just all elite courtiers. Many people had poetic skills. Again, nomads had it, but also people of more humble backgrounds. And poetry was, the core of performance. It's hard to imagine it today, because today we have kind of formal poetry, with the poet laureates and this sort of material, which is written, but this is performed and written for a very small group of people. Instead, the best example is what we have, a living poetic tradition in rap and hip hop. But again, it's not necessarily the same. It's often done for commercial reasons or musical reasons, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not like any of us, to enter learned society, would have to be able to rap out for 10 minutes about the beauty of spring, or about the person paying for your education, in the hopes of getting a full scholarship. So poetry, again, was just a central aspect of society. Some of the people who were rewarded for good poetry were rewarded not only with money, but also positions. You could be, if you're a really good poet, if you're a good conversationalist, if you had a really good witty remark, you could become the Nadim, or basically what's called a boon companion. Basically, it's someone who hangs out with you, with the ruler or whoever, someone in charge. It's basically part of an entourage, right? He just hangs out, helps you around, keeps you company when it keeps you happy when there's a lot of pressure from daily formal etiquette of the court. And ultimately, he's a drinking buddy, right? So he's supposed to spend time with the caliph or the ruler and drink with him and kind of let him de-stress by being his good friend. At the same time, of course, the drinking buddy, the Nadim, because he's around the caliph so much, because he's around the center of power, ultimately becomes a power broker himself and ends up becoming a central figure within the court. So he's a sort of courtier slash drinking buddy. And what he does is he always has a good line of poetry that he's come up with or is ready to cite. So he's moving between breaking different social boundaries as he's doing this. The main place that people were doing poetry or performing poetry was the so-called majlis. And this was the space in which one's adab was performed. Majlis can mean a salon, but this means sort of a semi-public, semi-private gathering. It's between public and private. Public in that all sorts of people, well, it was by invitation. It was usually in the private household of someone or in a court. So it wasn't just open to everyone, but it was meant to be a performative space. You were performing amongst your peers, and your peers would ultimately judge you based about what you would say. There's all sorts of majlises devoted to, grammar or sciences or just reciting poetry, etc. But poetry was the major event in the majlis. It's what people spent most of their time preparing for, coming up with poems to recite to their patrons or to their friends. It was where they spent all of their time. But there's other things that they did in the majlis. One of them is just, it was basically a version of what the Greeks used to call a symposium, where they would lie reclined, drink wine, eat food, and listen to music and recite poetry. And you can actually see versions of this. These are from much later manuscripts, but the majlis as an institution, cultural institution, continued. People would sit around, drink wine, listen to music, get drunk, and continuously develop social connections, but also poetic skill. Now, if you remember, technically, drinking wine is forbidden according to Islamic law. Even in the Quran, it says drinking wine from grapes is not allowed. Strictly forbidden, especially performing prayers while drunk is forbidden. But we have to remember that this was an integral part of courtly culture. Part of being a king, part of knowing how to be learned and to demonstrate yourself, comport yourself in front of the king, is knowing how to drink properly, right? Because that's what kings did in the Byzantine and Sasanian realms, and that's what probably they were doing in any case, continuing onwards. So in any moment, you had your drinking buddies, you had different people in the court and the majlis constantly drinking wine. And in fact, there's a long list of advice about how to drink properly, right? So you had to make sure what was responsible drinking at that time. One author named Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi wrote a manual about kind of party crashing, how to, stay cool and stay polite while crashing different people's majlises or parties. And he says this, beware of drunkenness, for if the crowd sees you stumble or bungle your speech, they'll judge you by it. Drink 5 cups, 6 cups, 7 cups, but don't become drunk. If you take care not to become drunk, when you rise up, you'll still have your intelligence. Now, how do you drink 5 cups of wine? Well, one, you have to think about the fact is that they drink out of these saucers. So it was probably different. 2 is like the Greeks, they were diluting the wine with water. So they had a saki, the wine bearer, in this case, a beautiful boy, who was also a tempting figure of romantic interest. And the sake provides everyone with wine properly diluted, but still the whole point is to never show that you're drunk, right? You always have to control over yourself. That said, wine was such a major part of poetic life, of social life, that there are even wine poems. One of the most famous one is by a figure named Abu Nawas, again, writing at the peak of the Abbasid period. And he says, shall I spurn it? Here, of course, obviously wine, when God himself hasn't, and our own caliph shows it veneration. Superlative wine, radiant and bright, rivaling the very sun's scintillation. While we may not know heaven in this life, still we have paradise's libation. Right, so a very strong obsession with wine and its powers. And often during the majlis, during these poetic transformation, some of it was actually accompanied by music. Most of the best poems were meant to just be recited, for people to absorb the interplay of language, right? Just like we enjoy poetry today or rap. But a lot of it was also occasionally played along to music, not in the same way that we would imagine it, but at least you would have music in the background played by female slaves or male musicians. One of the main instruments that they were playing is what is called a al-oud. If you say that together, al-oud, you get basically the word that it was used in medieval Europe, the lute, which is another instrument that came along from the Arab speaking lands, probably from Spain, and moved into medieval European culture. Now, again, another example, music was considered technically unacceptable because it was a form of diversion, of what they call of having fun without paying attention to God and piety. But it was, of course, a central aspect of daily life and of kingly life. And so exceptions were made and people just did it anyway, because in the end, Islamic law is not the sole determinant of what it meant to be a Muslim. Now, if you were particularly rich and powerful, you would have what are called basically types of geishas, consorts, who were supposed to, courtesans, who were supposed to be slaves that focused on performance. And in fact, many female slaves, not only were they concubines, but they were specifically meant to entertain their master. So they were given long lessons in poetry recital, in musical composition, in musical playing, and a whole variety of other dancing and a variety of other things. The most trained and special courtesans, Kiyan, were essentially extremely elite and very powerful figures. One of the most famous ones is a musician and poetess called Adab. She composed almost 1,000 poems that we have today, or at least we have some of them. And she was basically a courtesan to two caliphs, Al-Ma'min and then his brother Al-Ma'mun. And then she died in 95, and she was granted so much land and so many properties thanks to her poems and thanks to her entertainment, that she died at basically a very old age, extremely wealthy and extremely powerful. And then she trained generations of Kiyan courtesans under her. This is what Abu Nawas wrote about her. This is, by the way, a depiction from a fresco from of female dancers from the period. So this is again Arib. She demonstrates piety outwardly to God's people, and then meets me with a coquetry and a smile. I went to her heart to complain, but wasn't alone. There was a queue for a mile. So there were so many people in love with this woman. And the capacity to transform poetry and public performance into a form of power is one of the ways that slave women were allowed or could convey power in this sort of society, but it wasn't available to every type of woman. Let's compare Arib to a Abbasid princess named Ulayya. Ulayya was living around the same period, a bit before. She was the daughter of the Caliph Al-Mahdi. Interestingly enough, she could not perform in public. Why? Because she was a well-known and a respected woman. And in fact, and the idea here is that because she had to represent the family, she couldn't be someone who was also observed and criticized in public. So the only people who actually saw her poems, in a sense, were the other women in the palace, and there would be probably hundreds of women in different ways attached to the palace. We know about her poems because they were so good that were basically stolen by other poets, performed under different names and so forth. Pieces of her poems have been preserved haphazardly from in the poetic records. And one of the things she did is basically switch around the traditional beloved structure of a poem, which is in the Ghazal, is all about a poem called the Ghazal is about the searching for the remnants of the beloved, right? You're the lover and you're looking for the beloved. This becomes a metaphor for God. It also becomes a metaphor for wine drinking, for union with God, for everything in a sense. And so it was important. The poet is searching for the beloved. The beloved is usually a young boy, kind of adolescent boy, but can also be a woman. In traditional Arabic poetry, the lover is searching for traces of the beloved, and he comes across the remnants of the camp and sees pieces of the beloved's aspect. So what Ulayya did is transformed her vision of the beloved she couldn't have a male, so she turned it into a servant named Tal. So let's compare that to Arib. unlike Olaya, Arib was a slave, so she didn't have her freedom. She was owned by the imperial family. Um, and she performed now publicly in front of the caliph, in front of the couriers, and in front of the female slaves, other female slaves. So she wasn't performing, perhaps she was performing in front of the women, but she was performing in front of men. She was performing in front of men. And she becomes renowned because of this. She has a public persona. She becomes renowned for her poetry, for her musical ability. She is able to have her work performed under her name throughout the world, and she gets recognition for her poetry because she has the public authority of the authorship as a poetess, and that's why she ends up dying, rich and famous, because she ultimately is granted all these lands and rewards for her poetry. Of course, Alaya also, I'm sure, was rich and didn't have to worry about material things. But at least in the terms of whose poetry lived on, who became more famous, it was ultimately Arib, even though she was a slave and she was a concubine. She only could control this world she could succeed in the world as a slave, whereas a freed woman couldn't. So where are all these women in the palace? Many of them are some of them are in the harem. What is a harem? This picture from the back, which you saw, is what Orientalist imagery or painters depicted it in the 19th century, kind of a space of pleasure, of hedonism, etc., right? People dancing and playing music and having sex, etc. But really, the harem is just a private space for women and children. In any household, it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be the royal household. And we already saw it in different places, like the sanctuary in general is called the harem. So the harem of the sanctuary in Mecca and Medina, etc. So spaces in which the public are not, or some people are not allowed to enter, right? In the harem, in the family, you have a space in which people outside the family are not entering. So if you were to look in the division of some sort of traditional house or something, there'd probably be a space for people to receive members of the family, outside members, and then space where the family itself would live, where the women folk would be, etc. That's only if you owned a house big enough to have all that. Now, so in the harem, you would have wives, children, concubines, female slaves, male eunuchs, who are technically guardians of the space. And it generally, as I pointed out, referred to a place of sanctuary and is under the protection of someone, usually the guardian, the male, the huram here. Before the 10th century, there wasn't actually a separate harem in the Abbasid palace. In fact, each princess basically had her own palace where she held court, etc., etc. Later on, this was all consolidated into one central palace where the Abbasid family lived. But at that point, the Abbasid family was much less rich and much less powerful. So they had to consolidate their holdings anyways. But so what we have before is that each of these women are living in separate areas, separate palaces, with their own households and retinues, and probably on occasion also coming to the household of their husbands, etc., if they were married. One last thing to think about is that the concubines generally lived in the palace of their owner, not in the palace of the family itself. So once they started moving all the princesses in the family, female members together, then they started establishing a hierarchy, and that was usually under the queen mother, the mother of the current caliph. So not the caliph's wife or the favorite concubine. And in fact, kind of similar to other later dynasties, the Abbasids stopped marrying after Harun al-Rashid. Before, it was common, for example, to send children out to be trained in the provinces. So Al-Ma'mun was sent out to Khorasan. Each one was given a different province to administer. But afterwards, over time, it became more and more clear that The children were kind of kept in the harem, in the palace itself, and were not trained directly through governorships. But by that point, the Abbasid Empire itself had come to end as a central thing. In this moment of what do you call it? Of a central harem, you have certain figures, or even before, you have figures that are able to again amass power in different ways. So if we look at, for example, the story of Khayzuran, she was a concubine who actually ended up becoming the wife. This is rare. Usually you give birth to a male son and then you're manumitted. But here she became a wife of the Caliph al-Mahdi. Now, her children, she had two, Harun al-Rashid and al-Hadi, ended up taking over the caliphate. So it's actually, al-Mahdi had previous wives and other people, and had previous children, but even though they were kind of the older ones, because she was a stronger and more capable person, she was able to push her children into power. And ultimately, she actually preferred her second son, Harun al-Rashid. These are all Renial names, they have actual names, but Harun al-Rashid over her other firstborn son, al-Hadi, and so kind of pushed him into power specifically. And then once Harun al-Rashid came to power, he in turn supported his mother, and the two of them kind of combined together to form a strong power center here. She undertook a massive building program in Mecca. She was a patron of different arts and of poets, etc. And he was also undertaking a variety of transformations in the empire. So mothers and sons often work together in these formats. So let's keep that in mind as we think about the role of women in Abbas society.